in order to understand the Corkscrew ecosystem, you have to first frame it. And you frame it both in time and in space. And the spaces we're talking about are the width of Florida. We'll begin at the Lake Wales Ridge in central Florida and come west toward Corkscrew Swamp. Coming down off that ridge, the land becomes very flat. And it becomes flat because it was once the sea bottom. And the sea bottom collected calcium deposits from the life that was there. It's what gave us all of our limestone. The limestone is porous. It erodes very easily. And so water trickles down through it. It creates hollow areas underneath, and some organic material gets down there. But in addition, organic material begins to collect on the surface. So we've got a rocky base, the limestone, with a little bit of organic material over the top of it. And when the water comes flowing toward the Gulf of Mexico, it's just a very, very gradual change. Now, to put this in a time perspective, during the last 1 to 4 million years was a period known as the Ice Ages. And we had a series of periods when ice covered much of North America as far south as the Missouri and Ohio River. Florida never saw any of that ice, but the results of the cold were there. And the results of the ice in the middle of the continent that in some places was over a mile thick. All of the water tied up in the glaciers had to come from somewhere. It came from the ocean, fell as snow, and stayed there as long as there was an ice age. It meant that Florida was once much larger than it is today. If you look at a topographic map that shows the sea bottom, you can see that the sea is relatively shallow in the Gulf of Mexico. It falls off very quickly off the Atlantic coast into the area that's now harbors the Gulf Stream. But Florida was much bigger during the ice ages, but in between the ice ages were periods that were much warmer than today, real global warming. And so sometimes it was only the mid-Florida ridge that was exposed and a series of islands. And the rest of this area was underwater. Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary would have been underwater at the peak of the interglacials between some of the glacial periods. And underwater, it was subject to calcification and deposition of materials from coming off the ridge, sand and things like that. It was a very level plain going very gently toward the west. In the last 5,000 years, this level plain, as the climate began warming again following the last ice age, became a prairie. A prairie probably very much like the prairie you see here, with lots of grasses and other herbaceous plants that came in. The climate was warming, the climate was changing, the sediments were building up, so there were more nutrients in the soil, and eventually trees could move in. But as the climate changed, Florida, Southwest Florida in particular, developed a climate that had a wet season and a very distinct dry season. And the dry season occupied much of the year. So any life that was here had to be life that could be sustained during the dry season and then could tolerate flooding during the wet season. The water coming from that central Florida ridge would start out at a relatively rapid rate coming down the slopes of the ridge. But then as it hit the flat area, it would go very slowly, and it would follow the path of least resistance. And so what we ended up seeing was a serpentine river that was coming down, flowing toward the Gulf of Mexico, just bending and twisting every which direction, which is where Corkscrew Sanctuary got its name, because that river coming off that central ridge in Florida was once called the Corkscrew River because it twisted and turned so much like a corkscrew. The river no longer has that name. We changed the name of the river. It's now called the Imperial River, and it does continue to flow into the Gulf of Mexico and North Fort Myers, but It was once called the Corkscrew River, but today we recognize this whole area in here now, which was a relatively low area where water stayed longer, as the Corkscrew Swamp. In the early 1900s, a Fort Myers resident who is well known, Henry Ford, decided that this was an area that really should be protected, and he offered to buy it for the state of Florida as a state park. He thought it should be preserved. The state thought it was swampland and didn't deserve being protected. If anything, it deserved to be drained. And so they turned Henry Ford's offer down, which Henry Ford probably would certainly have regretted today. The Lee Tidewater Cypress Company bought the land, and they began cutting the cypress. About 60% of the commercial cypress in North America was found in this area. So it was a major cypress area, and cypress was in high demand because it's a wood that doesn't rot very fast. It's a very durable wood. They continued cutting. World War II came along, and during World War II there was a very high demand for cypress because it didn't rot. And our troops were in tropical countries where rot was very rampant. And so they were cutting and cutting and cutting. And then finally, in the early 1950s, it was suggested that there wasn't much left. It was suggested that we really needed to buy this land and preserve the swamp that is left. And John Baker, who was then the president of the National Audubon Society, had this vision of having a sanctuary of the last remaining cypress. Unfortunately, we didn't have the understanding then that we have today, that you can't just preserve a small area and expect the system to continue to work. The system is influenced by everything that's around us. And so we see the Corkscrew Sanctuary today as a minimal area, really, and it's constantly being bombarded from the outside. What happens outside of the Corkscrew Sanctuary is going to have an impact on what's in here. And so it's important, if we wish to have this for the natural wonders that are here, that we pay attention to what is done on the outside. And I think most people today understand that. And I hope that they can build on this understanding and pass this understanding on, that clearing a forest, draining a swamp area adjacent to this, or sometimes even miles away from here, can have an impact on what's going to happen here. We already know that with the wood stork, that they have to feed outside of this area because there's not enough area within the Corkscrew Sanctuary for them to get all of the food that they need. So in the last 500 years, trees have moved in, and this area has produced some of the finest timber, swamp timber in the world, the bald cypress and the pond cypress. Bald cypress in the deeper water areas, pond cypress around the fringes and between the prairie and the bald cypress. And then on the other side of the prairie, you can see ground that's higher by inches. Just a few inches make a difference, because it's how long the water is on the land that's going to determine what kind of plants are going to be there. When the rainy season approaches in early May, the first thunderstorms that come in produce what's known as dry lightning. The ground is dry. We've had several months without rain or with very little rain, and so fires are more apt to get started. And so early May, early June are the times when natural fire would have been most frequent here. And that's when this pine forest would burn. And the pines are adapted to live with fires, so when a fire comes through, they survive, but their competition doesn't survive. So that's why we have the pines there. The grassland is wet enough so that some years fire will come through the grasslands also and burn it, but in other years there will be enough water here to keep the fire out. And so we get the grasslands protected by the moisture that's here, but we get the grasslands also maintained by the fire that comes in periodically, but less frequently than in the pines. Once we get to the edge, where we get the pond cypress, once again we have a shorter season of water on the surface than we do in the interior. And so the pond cypress can survive here. And then we go to the interior and we get some water in some areas most of the time. Most of the time the soil is going to at least be wet. And so we get yet a different flora, a different kind of vegetation in the interior of the forest. At any rate, John Baker and the National Audubon Society were successful in raising the money, and the president of Lee Tidewater Cypress Company understood what they wanted and was sympathetic to it. So Lee Tidewater Cypress Company donated some of the land for the preserve, and Audubon raised the rest of the money for the preserve. And we have Corkscrew Sanctuary as it is today. The sanctuary has grown and become one of the premier places for birders and nature enthusiasts and people who just want to see the ecosystem that used to cover much of Southwest Florida 100 years ago.
Corkscrew Swamp is one of the greatest conservation stories in the history of the United States. Back in the very early 1900s, the Audubon Society formed to stop the slaughter of the herons and egrets and other wading birds for their plumes. And they were getting legislation passed to make it a crime to kill the birds for their feathers, but there wasn't anybody to enforce the law. So what they did was they raised funds and hired local people to actually go to the wading bird colony sites and stay there throughout the nesting season and actually physically guard the birds. And these were the Audubon wardens. Between 1910 and 1914, there was actually an Audubon warden stationed here at Corkscrew, long before anybody thought of making this place a sanctuary, an Audubon sanctuary. It was just a very important wading bird colony site. And that warden's name was Rhett Green. He was deputized by local law enforcement officials, and he carried a badge and was authorized to use deadly force in the protection of the birds. He was fully armed. And luckily, Rhett Green never had to use his gun. He camped out near the area where the boardwalk is now, and he just guarded the birds every single day. He was here for months, came in on horseback. Now, during the Audubon Warden Protection Days, there were 3 Audubon wardens killed in the line of duty. There was one killed on the coastal islands of South Carolina. His name was Reeves. Columbus McLeod patrolled Charlotte Harbor, and he didn't come back from patrol one day, and they found his boat. They found his bloody hat and an axe handle, and they never found Columbus McLeod. But the most famous Audubon warden was Guy Bradley, and he was stationed at Flamingo at the southern tip of Florida in what is now Everglades National Park. And unfortunately encountered some plume hunters that were known to him. He had arrested them before, but this time they shot him down in his boat. They proved that Guy Bradley never fired his revolver. It was intact, laying there in the bottom of the boat with him. They took the killer to Key West and threw him in jail. He pled self-defense and was released, and was never convicted of a murder, even though everybody knew he did it. So those were bad times, but the good news is the laws were passed to protect the birds, and they were enforced, and the plume hunting stopped. So Red Green, his last year here was, I believe, 1914. Everybody went home, except certain naturalists, ornithologists who would come here to check on the birds and see how this great nesting colony was doing. And in the very early 1950s, so we're talking 40 years later, people noticed that the logging companies were cutting down the old-growth forest and cutting down the trees that the birds nested in. The main logging camp was down at Copeland, just north of Everglades City, and they built elevated railways all the way up here to Corkscrew to log this forest, use steam-powered locomotives. And so there was a campaign by the Audubon Society. They were one of the key players in this campaign to save the old-growth forest at Corkscrew. Turns out that the logging had been so extensive that this turned out to be the largest stand of unlogged cypress left anywhere in the United States of America. And this kind of forest is really only in the southeastern United States, so it's anywhere in the world. There was a lot of public outcry throughout the United States. This was a national campaign. And school children donated money towards the effort to buy the cypress forest. Major corporations like Florida Power and Light and Arthur Vining Davis and garden clubs and organizations like that all donated money to buy the forest. And the logging company, the Lee Tidewater Cypress Company, was cooperative. And they didn't want to be the bad guys to cut down the last old-growth forest. So what they did was they said, well, you know, the swampland's pretty worthless. We'll cruise the timber, and you'll pay us for the value of the timber, which was much more than the value of an acre of swampland. But the deal was struck, and the first deeds to the property for the sanctuary, which it was unclear if Audubon would actually own it, but the state park system didn't want it, other organizations didn't want it, so Audubon actually got it by default. And the first deeds for the land were transferred to the National Audubon Society in 1954. And the decision was made, since this is such a broad and popular campaign for people throughout the country, that we'll build a boardwalk and actually give the public access to the cypress forest. So the nearest office of the Audubon Society was in the Florida Keys in Tavernier. And so they dispatched a warden from the Keys to come over here and actually establish a campsite at the new sanctuary. So we're talking 1955 by this time. And his name was Hank Bennett. And he was a warden and a tour guide for Audubon. And another gentleman was Bob Allen, who was their scientist who did the life history of the roseate spoonbill. And so eventually they found some local people who lived in the village of Corkscrew, which is north of the swamp. But there was actually a little pioneer settlement there. They had their own school at one point, and the pioneering family that established the village of Corkscrew was the Whidden family. They came from the north with their cattle. They were cattlemen and farmers. And Audubon hired them as wardens to help develop the new facilities here and build the boardwalk. So they built a little house for Sam and his wife, which is now our guest cabin. And they started on the boardwalk. And the first section of walk went from the Pine Flatwoods out to the North Lettuce Lake. And that was it. And then every year they would extend it until it went to an area south of our observation platform today. It took several years. The first attendance data we have for the sanctuary, because they charged admission from day one, was 1960. And in 1960, Immokalee Road had not been built. You got here in off-road vehicles, on dirt roads and Jeep trails, and that first year of data on attendance, 1960, there was 10,000 people visited here, found their way here somehow, and walked the boardwalk. And, you know, our history as far as the visitor program goes is that we're always trying to keep up, because growth, the visitation growth just continued every year until in the 1990s, we were reaching 100,000 visitors annually, which is pretty amazing. And I don't know how many million people have been here, but it's a lot. It's world famous. Sometimes I think we're better known in England than we are in the United States, because I talk to local people here in the Naples area. They've never been here. They may not even know about it. They may have heard something, but they don't know what's out there. And in the meantime, you're here, and everybody's from England and Germany and France and all over. So it's a very successful program. We've rebuilt the boardwalk twice. My earliest days here, I was hired in 1968, and the day after my high school graduation, I moved into the dormitory with some of my buddies. We repaired the old walk, and we added a spur, which made the walk circular. Up until 1968, you walked out on the boardwalk, dead end, turn around, walk back. And the number of people was so great that you couldn't pass wheelchairs, you couldn't take a picture because people were always walking by you. So we made it a circular trail in 1968. Repairs continued. That's what I did all throughout my college days. We'd come here summers and spring breaks, and they always had a job for me here. And so the walk had become so dilapidated and rotten by the late 1990s that it was no longer repairable. So we decided to build a new walk. The really neat thing about Corkscrew Sanctuary is that it has escaped the canals and levees and pump stations that have so devastated the rest of the Everglades system. We know here from our long-term measurements, decades of measurements of rainfall and water level, that the relationship of rainfall and water level here hasn't changed. So this is a wetland you can go to that still functions. And regulatory people come here for training because they can see a wet prairie or a pine flatwoods or this pond cypress forest and know how it's supposed to work. We have measurements. The amount of time that the water stands above the land is called a hydroperiod. And that hasn't changed here. So if someone wants to recreate a marsh, a prairie, a cypress forest, we can give them the data that shows just how long those areas should be inundated and what's a natural water regime for them. And our water quality is good. We have places where we've been impacted in isolated places by agricultural and some mining runoff. But basically the water quality is good, the quantity is perfect. As long as it keeps raining in the summer in Florida, this place is functioning just fine. And so Corkscrew is a place where we don't have to invest in restoration. It's not going to take $1 billion to restore Corkscrew Swamp. All we have to do is protect it and keep the surrounding land uses as low impacting as possible. And so that's what we spend a lot of our time doing, reviewing permits for agricultural and residential developments, making sure that what they do off Corkscrew Swamp does not ultimately affect any of the water quality or quantity that's coming into the sanctuary. It's constant. The campaign to replace all the facilities at Corkscrew started back in 1994. The first thing we built was the Living Machine wastewater treatment system. We were far beyond septic tank and drain field technology. We just had too many visitors, and that kind of technology did not work. So we built the Living Machine, and it's a recycling system. It reuses the water that goes through the toilets and urinals and sinks. It's recycled and cleaned up by biological processes in the machine. And it's designed to handle 10,000 gallons of wastewater a day. And we fired it up in October of 1994. That was our first big project for new facilities. And it's been running continuously ever since, every day. And there's no odor, and there's no noise, and it really has been a very successful technology. And we started on the boardwalk in 1995, and what we did was we built in the off-season. We would start building in May through the summer, and then we'd knock off in early December. And we did that for 2 years, 1995 and 1996. We wound up with a 2¼ mile boardwalk, which the old boardwalk was 1.75 miles, so we added a little distance to it. We feel that it's as big and long as it can be and still be comfortable for visitors. We put the new boardwalk in new places, and we actually left the old boardwalk in place, and we were never closed a single day while we were constructing our boardwalk. We were open continuously, and visitors would walk on the old walk and look at the new one being constructed. It was pretty interesting. So then we built the parking lot because we didn't have a parking lot. And we would actually keep a 4-wheel drive truck out on the lawn that was where people parked, but it would go underwater in the summer. So we had a 4-wheel drive truck and a tow strap to pull people out of the mud, and decided that we needed, I'm not a big fan of parking lots, but ours is unique in that it has bioswales, and all of the water that falls and runs off our parking lot goes in, rather than medians that you park up against, we have swales. The water goes in, there's plants and organisms in there that treat the water, any oil, any antifreeze or anything like that. And then there's 2 big lagoons hidden back in the forest to the east of the parking lot. And so it's fully treated and very clean when that water goes back into the roadside ditch and eventually down into the swamp. Then we started on the visitor center in 1999, and that was a 14-month project. And it's I think this is the most beautiful boardwalk on the planet. I think the Nature Center is the best in the entire Audubon system of nature centers throughout the country. Everything works. The living machine works. The parking lot's beautiful. It's starting to grow, and the trees are getting bigger, and it will essentially disappear over time because of the landscaping we've done. So I think we have, state-of-the-art, ecologically sensitive facility here. The entire campaign was a $7 million campaign. This boardwalk cost $1.6 million. Living machine was about $500,000, and the center was between $3 and $4 million, something like that. So you get up there, took $7 million over about a 6-year period to replace all the facilities here. We took our time, we did it right, and I just think it's beautiful.
Corkscrew first captured the attention of Audubon in 1912, more than 100 years ago, when it commissioned Rhett Green as Corkscrew's first Audubon warden to protect Corkscrew's wading bird rookery against unsustainable slaughter by plume hunters. In the face of growing threats, the mission of Audubon at Corkscrew has expanded beyond plume-bearing birds to encompass protection and stewardship of the entire native ecosystem. Our mission is to protect the natural resources of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, its surrounding watershed and the western Everglades, and to influence Everglades restoration for the benefit of birds, other wildlife, and people. We accomplish these aims through land management, science, education, restoration, and public policy advocacy. Now, natural resource protection is at the heart of our mission. And while our greatest influence and principal responsibility lies here within the 13,000-acre sanctuary, we are part of a much greater ecosystem, elements of which stretch far beyond our borders, spanning the Atlantic Flyway, north into Canada and south into the rainforests of South America. As a private not-for-profit conservation organization, we have limited resources and depend on the support and generosity of like-minded individuals, foundations, and charitable companies. We have an obligation to honor our giving partners by using our limited resources to greatest effect. For Audubon, that begins with sound science. Audubon is well positioned to advance and apply our scientific knowledge of birds and their responses to environmental change to the purpose of a better understanding of our ecosystem and the threats to its health. Science also provides the ability to measure the ecological benefits to the system brought about by habitat restoration. Through science, we can assess our effectiveness. Wood storks are the indicators of wetland health, particularly here in South Florida. Why? What makes wood storks such great indicators of a healthy system? To understand that, you need to know both the nature of the wood stork and the historic landscape. Wood storks are tactile feeders. That means they feed by touch. As such, they excel at exploiting high concentrations of aquatic fauna, primarily fish and crayfish in shallow wetland pools. Historically, the flat, dimpled landscape and the dynamic wet and dry seasons of the Greater Everglades provided the ideal conditions for nesting wood storks. Now, Corkscrew is a part of this system. It sits in the midst of an historically rich mosaic of wetland types. The region at one time had produced prodigious quantities of fish and crayfish in the summer wet season, and over the course of an 8-month dry season, the water levels receded, trapping those fish in ever-shrinking pools, creating a fantastic aquatic buffet to feed thousands of nestlings that adorned the tops of Corkscrew's ancient bald cypress forest. In 1913, ornithologist T. Gilbert Pearson visited the Corkscrew. Guided by Audubon warden Rhett Green, he came to see the wading bird rookery. And while he was most interested in the status of the plume-bearing birds, he noted in his bird study book that there were an estimated 100,000 wood storks within the nesting colony at Corkscrew at the time of his visit. Assuming Pearson was including chicks in his colony estimate, this would have been at least 20,000 nests, requiring nearly 9 million pounds of small fish just to feed the storks in this one colony, not to mention the ibis, herons, egrets, and spoonbills also nesting here. Now, this snapshot provides an essential frame of reference for understanding South Florida's historic natural resource wealth. At that time, in 1913, wood storks thrived because of these conditions, and today they languish because of the systemic changes to the natural system. What have we lost that has caused the collapse of the robust, awe-inspiring, sky-darkening populations of wading birds? What have we lost? The generic answer is wetlands. We've drained the wetlands. But a closer analytic look at those wetland losses, combined with our science-driven understanding of wood stork life history, refines that broad and unfocused answer. We've lost shallow wetlands, and it has been these disproportionate and mounting losses of shallow wetlands caused by systemic drainage throughout the Greater Everglades that has imperiled our wetland health and winnowed our once abundant wildlife down to a shadow of its former splendor. Wood stork nesting productivity has fallen by more than 90% at Corkscrew. The legends on the map panels in the Blair Center illustrate a system-wide loss of 95% of our wading birds throughout the Everglades since 1850. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, known by the acronym CERP, hopes to spend an estimated $19 billion on conservation projects here in South Florida in an effort to recover the waning health of the ecosystem. The South Florida Water Management District anticipates this effort will double the population of wading birds from 100 to 200,000. Which is still down 90% from the estimate of 2.5 million wading birds in 1850. As the system is restored, as it recovers, if it recovers, it should come to more closely resemble the landscape that provided the wood storks with abundant prey throughout nesting season. If done correctly, the nesting effort should rebound. Populations in South Florida should flourish. And for this reason, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, the South Florida Water Management District, and Audubon recognize the wood stork as an indicator of restoration success. Why have we placed so much emphasis on the stork? Because their nesting effort tells us so much about the health and condition of the region's wetlands, and of our success in restoring it. We have a saying here in Audubon, Florida, birds are a measure of the treasure, and this is certainly true of the wood stork at Corkscrew. Development has disproportionately affected native uplands and shallow wetlands, while largely avoiding direct impacts to deeper wetlands. It is simply cheaper and easier to drain or fill a shallow wetland than a deep one. Shallow wetlands are flooded on average from 2 to 6 months out of the year. These highly productive wetlands are often densely vegetated with grasses that provide cover for a diverse assortment of aquatic fauna. As such, these shallow wetlands make excellent nurseries for small fish, and contribute tremendously to the diversity, abundance, and biomass of the wetland system. We've lost an estimated 70% of our shallow wetlands within the core foraging area of Corkscrew's wood stork colony. We've lost approximately 82% of the shallow wet prairies in that same area. Loss and degradation of these productive wetlands is felt not only in the shallow wetlands themselves, but in the adjacent wetlands hydrologically connected to them. You see, it's not only the birds that migrate, fish migrate, both passively and actively. With the ebb and flow of the rains and the water levels rise and fall, the fish slosh back and forth, ultimately concentrating at the right times for wading birds, such as the wood stork. So protection, restoration, and rehabilitation of shallow wetlands throughout the greater Everglades has become a priority for Audubon, especially here at Corkscrew Swamp. We work to directly restore and rehabilitate shallow wetlands within Corkscrew and throughout the western Everglades. We employ sound science, research, and monitoring to measure our success and fill critical knowledge gaps to help refine our restoration practices. We work to educate decision makers, support and encourage important land acquisitions, improve wetland protections through public policy advocacy, and last, but certainly not least, we increase our ranks, advance a strong conservation ethic, and improve environmental literacy through intentional educational programming offered right here at Corkscrew, on our boardwalk, and in our Blair Center.
The volunteer program at Corkscrew has just been stellar. I mean, we have volunteers that have been coming out here for more than 20 years, and some volunteers have more than 5,000 hours of volunteer service. And I can tell you that when I became manager in 1983, that the previous manager had tried a volunteer program and it was completely unsuccessful, and I was advised not to try because it was too far to drive and people would just not continue to make that drive out to Corkscrew Swamp. But some people came to me who were regular visitors who wanted to volunteer. So we started the program. I mean, 83, 84, something like that. And there was a core group of maybe half a dozen volunteers back in those days. We didn't even have a volunteer here every single day. And now I imagine the volunteer program has over 100 participants. And it's highly successful, and some of those volunteers are very, very faithful, loyal fans of Corkscrew Swamp and Audubon. It's been a very successful program.
Volunteers play vital roles in each of these components. Volunteers at Corkscrew perform nearly every task that our staff performs, from executing a prescribed burn to doing citizen science to serving as a tour guide for a class of second graders. Volunteers greatly magnify our efforts. They are the front lines on the battlefield to win converts to the cause of conservation, as well as to directly protect and restore habitat. So many of our volunteers embody the same spirit that animated Corkscrew's first Audubon warden, Rhett Green. We catch a glimpse of this spirit in a quote of Green's as recorded by T. Gilbert Pearson, whom Rhett guided through the Corkscrew in 1913. He was speaking on the subject of plume hunters slaughtering egrets, herons, and spoonbills to get feathers for rich women to wear. With his Winchester rifle over his shoulder, Green remarked that no one was going to treat his birds that way. His birds. I turned that phrase over and over again in my mind, relishing it. Green took ownership of his role, his responsibility to protect the natural resources of the Corkscrew, as he called it. It is a beautiful thing when I see that idea in Rhett, and a beautiful thing when I see it in our volunteers who have embraced their role as stewards of a precious natural resource. As you all know, Corkscrew was purchased initially to save the cypress from logging. Corkscrew boasts the largest virgin old-growth bald cypress forest remaining in the world. Encompassing between 700 and 800 acres of unlogged bald cypress, many of them over 20 feet in circumference, over 100 feet in height, and well over 500 years old. This forest is as unique as they come. It is understandable that many visitors come to the Corkscrew to see an alligator. But whenever someone leaves, disappointed having not seen one, it represents a missed opportunity. They've walked through a natural wonder as rare and beautiful as any art gallery. I view Corkscrew's old-growth forest as nature's Louvre. with its majestic towering trees blanketed by mats of resurrection fern, accented with epiphytes and orchids, hosting a myriad of tiny migratory warblers, visited by colorful butterflies, scaled by strangler figs, buffeted, weathered, and broken by centuries of hurricanes. These trees were here before Columbus left Spain in 1492. Now, we have created a number of tools aimed at helping the visitor understand our forest and our mission. They include the Landmark Cypress Program, the Old Growth Forest Brochure, the 12 landmark cypress trees, and the signs created for those trees. You as volunteers can and should take advantage of these tools to capture the imagination of a visitor and get them to look up and really see this forest for its unique and enduring qualities. It is an important job. Corkscrew's boardwalk and old growth forest provide the context to engage people who are not a part of the conservation choir. As a volunteer, you can move people further along in their understanding and appreciation of wild places and wild things. And by doing that, you help advance our mission.
I love being a volunteer because very early in my life I had a Girl Scout leader that taught me about nature and only leave your footprints. Don't take anything back with you. And it's followed me ever since, and it was my career too.
Yeah, volunteering is really a gift when you get to come to a place and enjoy it as well as share it with someone else. But you also feel valued in a situation like this because you are able to help people enjoy something, learn something, appreciate something that they might not have seen or found. So it's really an exciting thing to do.
It's very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.